Welcome to How Brands Are Built, where branding professionals get into the details of what they do and how they do it. I'm your host, Rob Meyerson. Thanks for listening. Just like every other episode this season, today's episode is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. If you're trying to name a company, product, or just about anything else, go to squadhelp.com to launch a naming contest and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. Today, I'm talking to Miriam Stone, an independent strategist who works with agencies around the San Francisco Bay Area, including lifestyle branding agency Noise 13, where she's the strategy director. Miriam and I first met at Interbrand San Francisco in 2012. Since then, we've become good friends and frequent collaborators. She's one of the smartest, most thoughtful strategists I know. Before we get into the interview, I want to give you a little bit of context. When I created How Brands Are Built, I had a simple goal. Instead of focusing on high-level theory of branding like many other resources do, I wanted to keep it practical and tactical, really getting into the weeds of how branding people do what they do. Today's episode stays true to that goal. I've asked Miriam to walk us through her process for getting from facts and observations to useful findings and insights. Spoiler alert, she has 4 steps: collecting, grouping, synthesizing, and storytelling. You'll want to stay tuned to hear what each of those 4 steps entails and how you can put them into practice. It's an in-the-weeds conversation if ever there was one, but if you're looking to get more systematic in your approach to discovery and insight generation, what you're about to hear is priceless. Here it is. Miriam Stone, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So you and I have worked together a lot, and I know something that you've done recently is try to break down the process that you use to get from data that you've collected during a discovery phase of a project to the insights that you then use to inform a strategy. Can you talk a little bit about why you took on that project of breaking that down step by step?
I started thinking a lot about this question as I was training some new strategists to help me on projects. Up until this point, I had often done most projects just completely by myself, and I realized had been sort of developing these methods for, collecting a huge amount of data and then sort of processing that data and turning it into insights. When I started working with other people, other strategists, but really younger people who hadn't necessarily been through this type of strategy project before, people who kind of had that raw talent, but didn't have the training.
Yeah, it seems like one of those things that isn't trained generally. I mean, you and I have both worked at agencies, and I suppose we haven't worked at all of them, so who knows if this is true of all of them, but it feels like, it almost seems like the conventional wisdom is that it can't be trained, that you just sort of get it or you don't.
Yeah, I think I do have a different perspective on that. I think that there are parts of strategy that can absolutely be trained and that almost anybody can do if they sort of have the will or the excitement for it. I do think there's a part of strategy that is a little bit more kind of innate or takes a certain kind of talent that not everybody is perfectly suited for. But I mean, many people are, right? It's not like there's it's not some super rare quality, but I think that there's certain parts of the process that I think do take that little extra, innate spark or talent. But I think there are a lot of steps to the process that are almost a little bit rote. And those are the parts of the process that I was really excited to kind of systematize, in part so that I could actually have other people help me with them. I started to realize that I was taking on all of this stuff by myself, and these are the parts of the process that are really time-consuming and really overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Also, it really helps to have another person dig into the research with you as a strategist, so that when you get to that part that's more about, that spark of insight, you have someone to talk about it with who deeply understands it.
So talk us through the process a little bit, and maybe it's best, if possible, if you kind of do a quick flyover of the steps first, and then maybe we can go into some of them a little more deeply. Does that work?
What we're talking about here, I think, is getting from the beginning phases of the research where you just sort of don't know that much about the brand that you're working with and need to get an overview and understand it from different perspectives. And then all the way through sort of presenting back to the client, in this case, your findings. Like, what did you learn? And what are the things that you learned say about the brand and the potential directions for building of the brand? So these are all, I think, kind of the first steps, the inputs that go into a strategy and positioning project. This stuff all comes before you write anything down into sort of a brand positioning statement or brand platform or anything like that.
Right.
So I see it as kind of 4 key steps. The first step is about collecting and purely collecting. I think one of the things I did as a strategist when I first started was collect and then sort of try to synthesize and judge what I was collecting as I went through it. So for example, reading a bunch of articles and then saying, okay, I have an insight about the brand. Or listening to a couple interviews and saying, okay, now I sort of know what's going on, or this person said this one thing and that's a great insight. I really try hard, and when I'm training other people on how to do this, I really encourage them to basically not make any judgment until they have almost all of the research done.
Right.
Just listen, read and listen. If you're doing interviews or workshops, just be sort of a sponge, and just don't try to create too many insights.
So when you talk about just gathering information, can you talk through some of the different ways that you're collecting the information out there and eventually it's making its way into this process that you're talking about? Yeah,
so I typically try to look at it through the kind of traditional 3 C's lens from my business school days. So, looking at it through the lens of the company, which is sort of really internal things and things that make this brand authentic, through the lens of the category. So finding what's differentiated about them, making sure that we're really examining the landscape, and through customers, which really helps to get at what do our audiences need and how do we be relevant to them. So I'll kind of use those 3 buckets and make sure, I actually have like checklists for this where I'm making sure that all the information that I'm sourcing, that I have enough from each bucket. So for the company, you might want to look at internal documents and make sure you're doing internal interviews. You might do kind of workshops with the team, with the client team. Also really like digging into the brand itself. So like studying their website, obviously, but maybe even Googling and seeing what other people are saying about them, making sure you understand their history and the founding story. You could even look online at places like Glassdoor and see what employees are saying about them, that kind of thing.
Is there a minimum if a prospect comes and says they just want to do kind of the bare minimum discovery phase, whether or not that's ill-advised? Is there something that you use as kind of your go-to minimum amount of information in order to build a brand platform?
Yes, and this situation comes up all the time. So people pretty much always want to know what the minimum is, and I think often clients want it to be fast and they feel like we should just be able to figure it out. And I'm often pushing back and saying, no, like we really need more information to, create something. But that said, a minimum would be, I think, doing at least a couple client meetings or workshops. And I say workshops, I mean sort of fact gathering sessions from the team. I think having a couple people in a room together, a couple key people in a room together, taking them through a couple exercises that really get at some of these key things that we need to learn about, that can be an extremely effective way to get at, especially these internal things. But also you can learn a lot about the audience. Often clients don't have budget for a big research project where you can go out and survey or interview lots of people. And so interviewing the clients and what they've learned about the market can be an okay stand-in. It's not ideal, but it can be a stand-in. And then we might supplement that with desktop research. I love Stylus. We have a subscription to that, and it's my favorite kind of research tool for audience trends. And then I think, understanding the competitive landscape is something that can be done pretty quickly. So as long as your client is giving you some guidance in terms of who are the top competitors, you can always just survey it through looking at websites and things like that.
And since you mentioned exercises in those workshops, do you have any 1 or 2 favorite exercises you've been using lately?
One simple exercise that I think is really, really helpful is to talk about competitive points of differentiation. So, for example, I might have a client or have in a workshop, have clients list out every single competitor and then really force them to choose the top 3. Which it's funny because when you ask them to list out competitors, people can tend to just go on forever. And they'll sort of say, oh, it's so complicated. We have lots of different types of competitors. So I think once you're sort of forced to say, like, really think, you have to distill down, people can do it. They know who they're really up against. And so I'll have them, choose 3 and then usually break into groups and kind of do this up at the wall, either at a whiteboard or sort of those big kind of sticky papers. And I'll ask them to really look at each competitor and their own brand and list out the points of differentiation. So I think often people sort of think about from a product level, like what's different about our product, what benefits do we offer? That's like the kind of competitive analysis people always do. I think what we can bring, thinking about it from a brand perspective, is to say, okay, let's talk about the benefits of your product. Let's talk about the benefits, but let's also talk about the benefits of the competitor's, product. And then let's talk about the brand piece. What kind of story can they tell? What kind of recognition do they have? What kind of affinity do people have for them? What kind of perceptions do they have for them, whether it's warranted or not? And then same for us and for our brand. What do people think of us? What kind of history do we have? What's authentic about us? What story can we tell that's different from the specific competitor?
Okay, so step 2.
So step 2 is about, once you really have everything, it's about synthesizing. The first level of, let's just kind of see what we have. And that might mean sort of pulling out some overall themes or overall kind of groupings of the different types of things that we heard, but not necessarily creating any insights out of that yet. And I think that takes the pressure off of you as a strategist. It kind of takes the pressure off of the data to say, okay, let's just kind of do that first level of distillation. And then I think step 3 is taking a step even further back and saying, what is all this telling us on a deeper level? What kind of insights can we derive about the brand and the direction that it should go? Pulling out these groupings, you can start to take a step back and look at them and see things like points of tension, or things that sort of don't make sense, or things that are coming out really strongly. Mm-hmm. And you can start to put those things together into something more, which would be an insight.
So you're grouping. So first you're taking everything you found and you're just grouping them around themes, and then you're taking a step back and looking at what those themes are and maybe starting to draw lines between them, either things that don't match up or things that do, and kind of how they're associated with one another. And that starts to get you on a path toward an insight about the brand.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it. Another way to think about it is also even just in terms of numbers. When I first do that second step of pulling out themes, there might be something like 10 or 20 different themes that come out from the mm-hmm. research. And I think, to me, that's just far too much. That's not really distillation. That's sort of just
laundry listing
all the things you heard. That's right. So for me, insights, especially insights that are useful to a client, there should really only be maybe 5 or 6 big insights. And so that means pulling all of those different groupings together, thinking about what they say at a higher level. One of the things that I'll often do at this phase is actually, I have this all up on a wall. And so I might, especially if I'm working with somebody else, talk about it out loud, like tell a story.
And when you say you have it up on the wall, this is where you're using, I know you like to use sticky notes a lot. So is that typically what you're doing at this point?
Yes, absolutely. So
we should credit our mutual friend, Karen Williams here, I think, with the sticky note methodology.
I still call it the Karen method.
Thank you, Karen.
What's funny is I've actually tried a lot of different methods because I think the Post-it note method it's quite time consuming, actually. Especially to do it really well. But I tried other methods. I've tried using Google Docs. I've tried using spreadsheets. I've tried actually typing out notes and then printing them in some way on a paper and then putting those papers on the wall. I'm all about efficiency. And so I really tried to make it more efficient. Mm-hmm. And I just kept coming back to this method because it really works.
Today's episode of How Brands Are Built is brought to you by SquadHelp, the world's #1 naming platform. Here's how SquadHelp works. You launch a naming contest to engage hundreds of naming experts. You're guided through an agency-level naming process that goes beyond traditional crowdsourcing. The platform uses AI and includes name validation features such as audience testing, trademark validation, linguistic analysis, and quality scoring. And SquadHelp doesn't just do naming. You can also use their platform for taglines or slogans, as well as logo design. To launch your naming contest today, go to squadhelp.com and start receiving custom name suggestions instantly. SquadHelp, company, brand, and business name ideas by experts. This episode is also brought to you by Rev.com, offering fast, affordable, accurate audio transcription and captions. I use Rev all the time. I use it to transcribe episodes of this podcast, and I've also used it on client projects to transcribe interviews. I've tried some other services, and I keep coming back to Rev because their transcriptions are the most accurate I've seen, their turnaround time is less than 24 hours, and transcriptions cost just $1 a minute. Right now, Rev is offering listeners of this show $10 off your first order. To get that $10 coupon, visit rev.com/blog/HBAB for How Brands Are Built. Again, that's rev.com/blog/HBAB. Rev. Transcriptions made simple. I know you have some rules, and maybe these are Karen's rules as well, but the rules of using sticky notes correctly for this kind of work.
Yes. So I think the reason it works and the rules that make it work, they actually have to do with the form of a sticky note.
The classic square.
The classic square, yeah. But I think that it works because the sticky notes force you to distill as you're doing your research. So the idea is to use those small sticky notes as those classic sticky notes to put one fact on each. And so that fact might be something that you read in an article, or that fact might be something that you heard in an interview, or something that you heard in a client workshop. And those sticky notes aren't very big. I also like to use that kind of medium-sized Sharpie marker because, first of all, you can see it once it's up on the wall, but also because you can only write so much on the Post-it note. So because you can only write so much, you have to abstract a little bit as you're writing it. You really have to get to the essence of what that quote or that person or that piece of data is telling you. And then when you get to that next level of grouping, so step 2, you might use, for example, a slightly larger post-it note. For example, a rectangular one is nice because it sort of sets it apart. And that's where I start to write something a little bit more like a theme or a grouping or a little bit higher level observation. And I think Post-it notes are also great because you can move them around really easily. So once you have them up on the wall, you can now move them into groups. You can switch groups. And they're also nice because they go on the wall. And I think that there's something about developing insights and taking your head out of the deep research that you've been doing. It's really helpful to actually switch mediums. So instead of writing or instead of being at your computer screen, you're standing up. You're walking around, you're looking at the wall, you're moving things around. I think it does something good for your brain. And I think we talked a little bit about it, but I think this is where you really start to go from research and kind of general insights to the brand. Like, what are we doing here with this brand? And I think this is the place where you start to ask questions like, what is it about this brand that's really authentic? What are the stories that we heard or the things this brand has done in the past or wants to do in the future that make it really authentic and real? What's interesting about this brand that we can sort of pull out for the future and pull out for the brand that we're building.
And then the storytelling, I guess at some point you need to write this down, right? You need to write down, you need to choose not only what are the themes and the insights that you've derived from them, but how are you going to phrase them, which of course can make or break how they're interpreted by your client or anybody else who sees them. So can you talk a little bit about that transition from sticky notes on the wall to presumably sentences or phrases that you've written that go into a presentation or something like that?
Yes, and that is step 4, in fact, telling a story. So I'll have to credit this quote to Karen Williams once again. She always told me, don't think in PowerPoint. And I think it's really good advice. So I think that this last step of getting from your beautiful sticky note wall to a client presentation, usually in PowerPoint, is a difficult transition. Because I think often I feel like I have this very clear story in my head. And if I'm working with another strategist, we might just be sort of going back and forth and high-fiving and saying like, yeah, we got it. We really understand this. We've got some great insights. But like you said, now we have to get it on the proverbial paper. One of the things that I've started to do is actually write it out in outline form before ever using a PowerPoint or, any kind of presentation form. I typically now use a Google Doc so I can collaborate with others. And I try to write it out really like what will each slide say, kind of what's the key insight that I'll talk about on each slide or the key thing I learned, the key observation, how might I back it up? And I'll actually here start typing out those little facts or quotes that are going to back up my point. And I'll try to get it 70 or 80% of the way there before committing it to slides.
And that allows you to see the quote unquote story that you're telling all in one place, right?
Yeah, it does. And I think once you start doing that, you start seeing the holes that you didn't notice before.
So the approach to drawing insights out from competitive research is a little bit different. How is it different from what you've already described?
So I think the competitive audit process is, well, I guess it's in the word, it's a little bit more of an audit than it is just sort of a fact finding and putting them all up on the wall. Typically what I would do here is, this is an area where I actually do go right to PowerPoint slides. And I would create, or whoever I'm working with would create a slide or two per competitor. And I think that works because you really are needing to look at visuals and messaging. You really are wanting to create sort of a snapshot of each brand, of each competitor brand that you're looking at. But I think in a way that's the fact finding. So that's just the beginning. I think the next step is to take a look at all of them and actually try to bring them all under one roof and be able to sort of say something about the competitive landscape. Again, creating an insight that's useful for the brand. Sometimes it's about, finding that quote unquote white space, which sometimes it exists. Sometimes it's in a really competitive landscape, in a really competitive marketplace. For example, I did a project for a beer, a craft brewery, and there were over 700 craft breweries in California.
Wow.
So there wasn't really like white space. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, nobody's doing this. In those cases, it might be something more like we can tell a particular story about our brand and we can infuse a certain kind of personality that maybe our closest competitors aren't using. But regardless, I think it's really helpful to actually put all the competitors as much as possible into the same place. And that's where like a perceptual map comes into play. I know that there's a technical way to do perceptual mapping that's done through quantitative research. The type of perceptual mapping that most brand strategists I know do is a little bit more gut feeling, which is fine because I think that in many ways brands and brand strategy is about that gut feeling and that emotional feel that you have when you kind of look at brands. And so as a strategist or as a consultant, you do have value to add looking at a landscape for the first time and trying to just sort of put it all in one place and say, okay, well, where's everybody sort of sitting in this landscape? And where do we think the brand that we're working with could or should sit?
Once you've gathered all of those insights, so some of them are about the brand that you're working on, some of them are about competitors, some are about customers or consumers that may hopefully be buying this brand. How do you get from these well-crafted insight statements that are going into your presentation? How does that eventually turn into a really focused recommendation for what this brand should stand for?
I think it's important to kind of have those insights and then kind of put them aside and then say, okay, what is it about this brand that's truly authentic that we know we need to kind of hit on in the messaging or in the positioning? What is it that we know about our audience that's most important to them, that's most relevant to them? And same thing with the competitive landscape. What do we know about the competitive landscape? Where's that space that we want to play in? And so I think it's just one more level of abstraction. If you can really look at each of those buckets and say, one or two key things about the brand, whether that's the message or the story or the personality or the offerings or, the people behind it or who the audience is, if you can kind of distill down those things and maybe even try to put them into those buckets, I think that's that first step in crafting a brand positioning or brand platform. And then I think, it's knowing what model you want to use and really just plugging things in. One of the things that I actually do is I go back to the Post-its. I take a fresh wall. I might actually take pictures of everything and then take my original wall down and put up a fresh wall. And I often go back through my insights and go back through the presentation and just write down key words or key phrases or key ideas and put those on Post-its. And so now I might have like 25 Post-its that are just a little bit more abstract. They might be more sort of emotional words or more storytelling words. And then I might think about the model that I'm using and actually start plugging those Post-its into different parts of the model.
So you mentioned that whatever model you're using, and we both know there are all kinds of models out there, academic versions and agency models. What are some of the different ingredients or components within those models that you're almost always trying to populate with some of these words or concepts?
I think there's a couple really important things that really have to be in any model for it to be useful. I think something around, I call them pillars, but they might be strengths or something like that. But sort of just what does this brand actually do, I think is really important. I usually like to stick to three key things that really sort of root the brand in what they actually do in the market, what's actually unique about them, or their approach or something like that. So 3 to 4, I would say brand pillars, I would call them. That's really important. Some kind of description of the target audience. Usually I would talk about this more from a kind of psychographic or conceptual standpoint more so than demographic. Mm-hmm. You might talk about who the audience is in terms of where they work or something like that, or the type of role they have, or other kinds of demographic information. But I think more importantly, it's what do they believe? What is that? What are those core things, the things that they value that we really want to tap into as a brand? I think brand personality is really critical. That's 3 or 4 kind of key words that summarize sort of how the brand will behave, kind of the look and feel of the brand. And then often summing it up with some kind of essence statement or some kind of powerful line about the brand. Almost sounds a little bit tagline-y. That can be really helpful. It's not always easy to do, and sometimes you don't get there right away. So if it's more descriptive, that's okay. Sometimes it can be more sort of powerful and emotional, but some kind of sort of line that would sum everything up is really helpful.
And I don't know if it's just coincidence, the order that you said those things in, does that loosely tie at all to the order that you find you often populate these different parts of a model in?
I almost always would do that sort of essence line at the end. I find it, because that is really the distillation of all distillations, right? So you need to, at least for me, I need to know everything else going into it first to know whether I've got it. It's the line where I think of it almost like brand poetry, you know, where it's like there's no words to spare. And so every word needs to have meaning, often double meaning, but it also needs to sound good and be powerful. It's really hard. And again, you don't always crack it. I've had situations, projects that I've worked on where we haven't really quite cracked it, and that's okay. We'll just sort of use a line that more summarizes the brand, and that can be fine. But there's sometimes that it really just pops, and those are really exciting.
Do you, since we started the conversation talking about training people that maybe are less experienced, when you get to this part that you're not distilling but actually creating or writing, do you have any rules of thumb or just sort of rules that you use to teach people what is or isn't a good essence statement or a well-written statement, or maybe for any of those other components?
This is hard. I think this is where maybe it does help to have some experience, to have seen what kinds of things clients respond to. It also helps to have outside opinion. So anything I write, I make sure to share with other people. I guess the tip that I would have would be, it needs to be a combination of kind of functional, factual, and emotional. I think I've seen positioning statements and brand platforms and things like that feel like, yes, they capture everything that we've talked about or that needs to be talked about, but they fall flat. Right. I think sometimes a missing ingredient is that level of emotion, but also that level of distillation that we just talked about. So it's the kind of thing you have to write and then rewrite and then rewrite until it's truly as simple as possible. I think you always have to ask yourself, are there extraneous words that can go? You know, how can you whittle it down as narrow as possible? The more words, the more distracting it is.
Well, in the spirit of sticking to fewer words, why don't we leave it there? But I hope that you'll come back and join me again sometime on the podcast.
I hope so too.
Thanks for listening to How Brands Are Built. To learn more about Miriam, visit her website, brandplume.com. That's brandplume.com, or noise13.com. You can also find some blog posts she's written on how brands are built. If you found this episode useful, please tell people about it by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe there or wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can get in touch with any questions or comments through howbrandsarebuilt.com or any of our social media channels. How Brands Are Built is a production of Heirloom Agency, LLC. Our theme music is by Isha Erskine Project. I'm Rob Meyerson, and I'll talk to you next time. Thanks again.